Welcome to Homecooked History, the show where we try to recreate historical dishes in today's casual kitchen. My name is Megan, and I am a Michelin star chef and James Beard Award recipient. Just kidding. I'm actually not a professional chef, as you can see, because we are currently in my kitchen at home, but I am a professional historian, and today I am going to be presenting to you a favorite dessert of the 1930s and 1940s, molasses cookies. I feel like to say it right, you have to say like molasses. Molasses cookies. Molasses was a part of Americans' daily diet in both the northern and southern colonies. For instance, in New England, molasses was used for dishes like Boston baked beans, Boston brown bread, and Indian pudding. In Pennsylvania, molasses showed up in shoe-fly pie and apple pandowdy, and in the South, we see molasses jack and corn pone with molasses. So we see widespread popularity of molasses throughout the South, throughout the North, and we also see its influence on regional cuisine throughout time. So the recipe that we're using today was published in the Washington Times in 1920. It was part of an advertisement for Brer Rabbit molasses, which actually is the brand of molasses that we're going to be using today. I'm not affiliated with Brer Rabbit molasses, but the recipe calls for the cookies to be baked in a, quote, quick oven. So there's no time specified or no temperature, but a 1913 recipe for molasses cookies with similar ingredients calls for the oven to be about 350 degrees. So go ahead and preheat your oven to 350. So what is molasses? Well, it is actually the main byproduct that comes from the manufacture of sugar from sugar cane, boiled down into a syrup, like you do with maple sap in order to produce maple syrup. The final product is actually referred to as blackstrap, and it's not the same thing as sorghum, despite some misconceptions about that. The British refer to it as treacle, and in Japan it's actually called kurumitsu, or black honey. We are going to start by creaming our butter. Now we're going to add our molasses. So a thing that I did not realize is that molasses does not smell very good. So fun fact. There are numerous historical recipes for molasses cookies and other molasses products. In her first cookbook, the Appledore Cookbook from 1872, Miss Parloa provided a recipe for molasses cookies, which were originally a small cake form of gingerbread. They have a lot of the same ingredients, actually, and later on in 1913, Mrs. Lincoln, who founded the Boston Cooking School, published the school's first cookbook in 1884, and that included a recipe for soft molasses cookies as well. In another version of that cookbook from 1896, Fanny Farmer included molasses drop cakes, molasses cookies, and soft molasses cookies. So we see in a very short period of time different variations pop up of molasses cookies. We are going to add a tablespoon of ginger and a teaspoon of cinnamon to the mix. In many historic recipes, molasses was used as the sole sweetener. Other recipes would mix molasses with white sugar or brown sugar, and other variations included different mixes of spices. So traditionally, molasses cookies included ginger and cinnamon, but later they incorporated nutmeg and cloves. Other recipes for molasses cookies called for liquids like milk, sour milk, cream, and then coffee or water. And this speaks to all of the regional varieties of molasses cookies throughout time. Next is a teaspoon of baking soda. flour to the mixture. The original recipe calls for enough flour to, quote, make the dough soft, which is not an exact measurement. So we're going to start off with 2 cups of flour, adding a cup at a time, and if we need to add more, then we will. Looks like 2 cups of flour was not actually enough, so we're going to add an additional cup and see if that's a little bit better. It looks like we actually still need 1 more cup of flour, so this is going to make it 4 cups, and we'll see if that gives us the consistency that we need. It is now time to roll out our cookie dough onto a flat floured surface. We're going to take a rolling pin and we are going to roll out the dough until it is about 1/4 of an inch thick. So after you roll out your dough, you're going to take your cookies and you're going to place them on a greased cookie sheet. So molasses proved to be really trendy throughout the early 20th century, but it also proved to be the source of one of America's more bizarre tragedies. And I'm talking, of course, about the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. So in January 1919, a tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses exploded in Boston's North End. It was owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol and was 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, which is about 5 stories tall. Around lunchtime that day, the tank exploded and flooded downtown Boston, and this wave of molasses moved at a speed of approximately 35 miles an hour. And because molasses is a non-Newtonian substance, kind of like ketchup or whipped cream or toothpaste, it moved like a mudslide or an avalanche or a lava flow. And it ended up soaking several blocks, reaching depths of 2 to 3 feet in some areas. And in the process, this molasses crushed freight cars, it destroyed a firehouse, and it almost lifted a train right off of the tracks. This tragedy caused the death of 21 people and it injured 150 others. Many were crushed by the wave of molasses or the debris, or they drowned, and others died from injuries and infections that happened subsequently. In order to clean up the aftermath of the disaster, the area was hosed with salt water from fire boats and the streets were covered with sand. Cleanup was time-consuming and labor-intensive, and rumor has it that Boston continued to smell like molasses for several decades afterwards. There were 3 theories that were put forth to explain what caused the disaster. One was an explosion due to fermentation, the other was a potential bomb that had been set off, and the third was structural failure of the tank. And in litigation that followed the tragedy, U.S. Industrial Alcohol, who owned the tank, was deemed liable, and the court cited poor inspections and a lack of safety factors. So again, molasses was key not only in American food and cuisine, but also key in one of the more peculiar and devastating tragedies in our national history. Sprinkle the top of the cookies with a little bit of granulated sugar before you put them in the oven. Okay, our molasses cookies are ready to go into the oven. We're going to cook them for about 8 minutes and then we're going to pull them out, Let them rest for about 2 minutes and then transfer them to a rack to cool. The bulk of imported molasses was actually consumed within the continental colonies. The colonists themselves consumed about 90% of the rum available, almost 20 gallons per year for each adult male. In the 1790s, before domestic whiskey became popular and a competitor, the New England rum industry was incredibly productive. Molasses beer was also easy to make, less expensive than commercial beer, and it was a healthier alternative to impure water. Other than rum and molasses beer, molasses was also in other drinks like the, quote, blackstrap, which was a mix of rum and molasses, and the, quote, whistle belly vengeance, which combined homebrew, molasses, and brown breadcrumbs and was served hot. In 1733, the British Parliament passed the Molasses Act, and this was an attempt on Britain's part to increase its share of the market by adding a really firm tax to the molasses that was imported from the French West Indies to the British colonies. In the process, though, it threatened to destroy the New England rum industry, although enforcement was fairly inconsistent. But the unrest caused by the Molasses Act and other legislation like the Sugar Act contributed to the discontent in the colonies, which would later erupt into the American Revolution. It's time to take our cookies out of the oven. Let's see how we did. The 1913 recipe recommends letting the cookies remain on the hot cooking sheets for 2 more minutes so that they bake a little bit longer. After that 2 minutes, we'll take them off, put them onto a rack, and let them cool. It's true that the islands of the Caribbean Sea proved to be valuable sources for cane sugar and molasses, which was distilled into rum. And rum was a substantial colonial industry, almost to the point where rum was kind of like a form of currency. But the total average yearly export of rum to Africa, for instance, from all of the mainland colonies between 1768 and 1772 was only about 1/8 of the total production of the period, so not a lot. And there was essentially no market for molasses in Europe. Instead, the majority of molasses and rum exports from the continental colonies went northward, actually, to areas like Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. And several thousand gallons were actually traded to Native Americans for furs and skins, as well as other colonial neighbors in Florida, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. Okay, it's time. How do our molasses cookies taste? We are about ready to find out. Oh. Okay. They're pretty good. They're crunchy. That's kind of a surprise. I thought maybe that they would be chewier, but they're quite crunchy. Not exactly cracker-like, but there's definitely kind of like a harder biscuit quality to these. There's a really strong molasses flavor as well, so I think you really need to like molasses. I've seen molasses in other historic recipes like with gingerbread or spice cookies, so maybe if it had a little more sweetness to temper it out, because there's actually no sugar in these cookies other than the dusting on top, or maybe some spices to help create a more robust flavor and reinforce the molasses. I mean, they're fine, they're good. So, we'll take it. It's like a graham cracker. Honestly, it's got a very graham cracker-like quality to it. Laura Ingalls Wilder is perhaps one of the most beloved children's authors in American history. She was born in February 1867, and her family moved throughout the American frontier as a pioneer family, settling in Wisconsin woods, Kansas prairies, the plains of Minnesota, and settling eventually in the Dakota Territory. Her Little House books are partially autobiographical based on these experiences, and her stories were later adapted into the TV show Little House on the Prairie. Food was a major focal point of pioneer life, and Wilder documented a variety of recipes in her personal cookbook, which consisted of a scrapbook of recipes and clippings from throughout the 1930s and 1940s, when molasses cookies were especially popular. And according to the now out-of-print cookbook, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Country Cookbook, which was based on Wilder's compilation and collection of recipes, we can see her fondness for molasses cookies as well. For instance, in her molasses cookie recipe, she included coconut and orange extract and described the final product as a hearty, old-fashioned cookie jar cookie. So we see that not only did normal Americans enjoy this particular treat, but some of our more recognizable American icons did as well. Hey! Come here, I made cookies.
Like molasses up in jar.
Our second taste tester is here. What do you think?
Not bad. Not the most amazing cookies that I've ever eaten, but they're tasty. What did you think?
I thought it was kind of graham cracker-like.
Mm-hmm. Very dense.
Yeah. The reviews are in. Molasses cookies have been described as some of American children's favorite desserts. For instance, it was a popular late summer, early fall dessert, and according to one newspaper, a lot of children depended on them for their, quote, lunch dessert, so they would eat them regularly, if not daily. A newspaper from 1937 claimed that these cookies embody, quote, all of the desirable qualities of a cookie that should find its way into a cookie jar. Advertisements in the Evening Star newspaper from 1943 for Brer Rabbit molasses said that 3 tablespoons supplied about a third of children's daily minimum requirement for iron, which was imperative for, quote, good red blood. So there was this idea that was echoed in a 1949 newspaper that molasses cookies were actually nutritious, if not delicious. And a few years before that, in 1919, in another advertisement for Brer Rabbit molasses, there was this claim by one doctor that molasses is one of the healthiest foods a mother can serve children. I'm not quite sure about that, but I'm sure that it sold a lot of molasses and encouraged a lot of people to make molasses cookies. Well, we did it again. On this episode of Homecooked History, we tried to recreate a historic recipe for molasses cookies. Turned out fairly well. Let's put this one in the would recommend, but with changes category. Overall, it was a really neat experience, and we have several dozen cookies left over. So thank you for joining us for this installment. Hopefully we see you next time. And in the meantime, keep in mind that past or present, everybody's got to eat. Thanks, everyone.